act on and whatever, and then.
Now, I think by accident of the way it's screened, we've lost half of Dr. Hacking. And we don't want to lose any of you. So if you could, that's better. That works. That works. Yes.
Thank you. I've got a number of questions. I'll try and do them thematically, but they've come from a range of different sources, so I probably will fail in that. But we'll. I'm going to start by asking a question about confidentiality of the services, of the specialist services. So, you've told us a bit about the advantages of the psychological service being embedded in the multidisciplinary team. Where a patient distrusts the multidisciplinary team for the reasons that we've discussed a little bit this afternoon, and wants a service that is confidential, i.e. details are not shared with the multidisciplinary team, is that an option in the services that are currently in place? And can I start off by asking that question to Belfast and then open it, go through to Scotland and to Wales, please?
So yes, I suppose where we talk about services being embedded in the team, it is working as part of the multidisciplinary team, but it doesn't change our normal processes in terms of confidentiality in practice. So it isn't that we would expect, nor would we share all information with the various members of the MDT team, and that would usually be negotiated with clients on a one-to-one basis. So what happens in terms of the psychological therapy session is confidential. With it, obviously the usual parameters of confidentiality are still in place in terms of risk to harm of self and others, but it isn't an automatic that all of the discussion would be shared with the MDT team. That would be discussed with the client beforehand as to how much they would want to be shared or not.
Is that
yeah.
Scotland?
Exactly. I was going to agree and say that would be the same for Scotland.
And is that the same position in Wales?
Yeah, it's the same. But I think that possibly the setup is a bit different because the multidisciplinary team wouldn't necessarily be the medical team. Is that what we're referring to?
Yes, I think so.
No, so we wouldn't share it with the medical team because we don't sit within that medical framework. We sit in a different setting, so we wouldn't have direct contact with the MDT as such. Obviously, if that was requested and it was an agreement between us and the client, then we would regularly write to their consultant in charge of their medical care, let's say, but we don't sit in that MDT in the same way, so we wouldn't have those conversations now.
So you sit within the payment scheme, the payment support scheme?
Yeah, so we sit within that kind of, the support scheme structure, which is about the benefits and the financial component, and we're part of the emotional and psychological well-being component of that service, so separate from the medical care as such.
The next question.
May I just ask, arising out of that, to Dr. Stewart, part of the proposals is that the NHS will better inform, set up a system to let clinicians know about the particular consequences of infected blood, so that they can be more expert and less have to be informed by the patient of what infected blood was all about and how it might affect them. At the moment, they may just see one patient, presumably, with infected blood and nobody else, and they have to put that into context. So one of the ways that a person might seek to resolve the issue of how do I contextualize what my patient is telling me so that I can provide proper therapy is to ask one of the haemophilia doctors, for instance, can you tell me a bit about this and how does it affect someone in this sort of position? The difficulty with that is it may then begin to identify the individual. Is that a problem that you've experienced in practice?
I'm a policy and strategy person. I don't deliver services. I'm not engaged in services myself, so I wouldn't want to comment on what might happen in practice. I think I might add to that. I think it is quite likely that it would probably be the long-term conditions team that would most likely be engaged in such cases because of their condition. So I think it is less likely to be dispersed in an IAP team, more likely to be those who do that. And of course, if they were seeking further advice or information about haemophilia, they may not go to the same service that the person is treated in. They could,
Yes.
yeah, they could be talking to experts more generically.
Yes, so it might be something to bear in mind, perhaps, but without necessarily having the red flags flying.
Yeah, no, I think yes, it's a good point. It is something that I'll take to our clinical experts.
Thank you.
Next question again is to the specialist services. How should psychological treatment be adapted where it's been delivered by the institution that has injured the patient?
I think some of that was maybe mentioned slightly earlier, where there is an understanding that it may take a little longer to build up that trust or build up that therapeutic relationship, and more time is given towards that. It may also be that it was mentioned earlier that the appointment, we can have some flexibility about where that occurs. It might be online, it might be previously I've met somebody at their GP practice or at their home, until perhaps that person might feel comfortable to come into the centre. If they ever do feel comfortable to come into the centre, we are not working with somebody to force them to change what they're doing. It's to understand what's happening and understand if that is then negatively impacting on their physical care, their physical health care, or their psychological well-being. So I think a lot of it is very patient dependent. It will depend on what is going on for them, but I think we generally as clinicians will try and work collaboratively to figure that out and take the extra time that we're allowed in these specialist services to adapt and adjust around that.
Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I suppose I would say that there would also be an ability to perhaps customise based on the individual presenting for assessment, so that if there was a circumstance where the trust had irrevocably broken down with the provider organisation and the individual, well then we would endeavour within what we could to redirect the individual to a service perhaps in another organisation. But then you may lose the benefit of the specialist input in that regard.
Can I add something to just to expand on that? I suppose that implicit in what we have been saying throughout giving our testimony is that psychological treatment is based on a robust evidence base. And within Scotland, we have psychological therapies matrix, and information was provided around that in some of the previous submissions. So there are adaptations that may be required for this particular population that is based upon the expertise of the clinician understanding this population group, but the treatment modality will be based upon an evidence base that is a sound based upon the presentation of the particular person.
I think as well in clinical health psychology, which I suppose is where most of our, certainly Scotland themselves are probably coming from, it's not unusual to have challenges in some of those relationships, and psychology, I think, have a lot of expertise in kind of managing and negotiating, where there maybe are differences of opinion or there can sometimes be breakdown in relationships. So there probably is often an experience base in terms of working in those kind of circumstances as well.
The next questions are for you, Dr. Stewart. Can you help us with understanding why a gap analysis is being carried out, given that the inquiry has received evidence from the psychosocial expert group and evidence from infected and affected people about their experience and their need for psychological evidence? Are you able to help us with that?
So I think ultimately that would probably be a question for the Department of Health and Social Care, but I think it's worth pointing out, because we don't have, as the other devolved administrations do, direct experience of the conditions that they're seeing, although we've also spoken to them and had some advice. I think that gap analysis is to understand what isn't provided by IAPT, what might be coming forward, and therefore what would we need to provide if we commission such a service.
And do you know what the uptake of the specialist chronic illness pathway is?
I don't know, but if you wanted to know, I could find out and follow up with further information.
Do you know what modalities of psychosocial support are offered on that pathway?
I don't know, but again, I'm very happy to ask my experts and to follow up.
Do you... I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this, but do you know whether any assessment's been carried out as to how many sessions of therapy can be funded by the £900 from EVES?
I would struggle to answer that one because I know what we do on the NHS, and actually I can come back on your further question earlier about whether there is a cap, if you would find that helpful.
On the number of
and the number of appointments under the IAPT scheme.
Yes,
if
that would be
find
helpful.
Yes. Yeah. So I contacted our IAPT clinical advisor during the break just to clarify, because I didn't want to mislead you. NICE guidance does refer to an expected number of sessions as a guide, but there is no explicit cap. So if a particular individual would benefit from further treatment, that can happen under IAPT.
And what is the guide? What's the number in the guide?
I think from memory, I would want to double check, but from memory it's 6 to 8.
And again, this is maybe a question that you can't answer, but do you know whether or not private counselling is available through EVES for bereaved family members?
So my understanding is that it is available for those who are both infected and affected, and my expectation would therefore be that it would also be available to bereaved families. That is information I've gathered though from the EVES website, rather than being within my area of expertise.
You were telling we were giving some evidence about the advice given by NHS England in March 2020, and you were looking at the options paper.
Yeah.
Could you read out what the third option was, how it was sketched out, set out to the Department of Health and Social Care?
So option 3. Option 3 was described as bespoke NHS psychological support services for people with infected blood. As in the case of Wales and Northern Ireland, DHSC could fund a bespoke NHS mental health support service for people in England who have been impacted by contaminated blood. Based on initial advice from the NHS National Lead for Psychological Professions, it is suggested that a mixed model could be created that includes psychological assessment and formulation, signposting to an existing local service, or signpost to existing local services, e.g. IAPT, where there is active depression or anxiety disorder or other specialist services as required. It is expected that this would be the outcome for the majority of service users. Thirdly, a specific psychological therapy service for some service users. This would be for more complex adjustment and mental health issues, unlikely to be met by specific local services.
And do you know whether or not there was any subsequent advice from NHS England rowing back from that or narrowing the options?
I know there were further discussions of all three together. We did not, as far as I'm aware, I don't think we provided further advice in writing. If we did, I haven't seen it. I am aware, though, that there were several meetings. I was present at one of those, and by that point we were already moving. We'd already moved on. It was after William Vinall gave his evidence, which talked about us being in a position of looking at having EBS commission the specific assessment and then signposting.
It could be said that that third option that you have just read out to us is not terribly ambitious, even given the intervention of COVID. Is there any assistance that you can give us in that regard?
Could you repeat your question, please?
That third option was for a lot of referrals to go to IAPT, but yes, just for the more serious, if I can put it colloquially, to be dealt with through a bespoke specialist service, and it could be said that that option isn't hugely ambitious. It's not suggesting that there should be a bespoke specialist service for everybody in England, as there are in the other devolved nations. Even given the intervention of COVID, is that a surprise to you that it hasn't got any further than it has? That it still seems to be waiting for a decision on that?
So it would still be, whilst you might describe it as not terribly ambitious, it still would require a specific development specification, commissioning and an agreement between the bodies as to funding and supply and providing it. I think also relevant in this context, which I think is different from the other nations, and is apparent from even the entirety of the description of that third option in its entirety: assessment, signposting to IAPT, and then a specific bespoke service for anyone whose needs are not met by IAPT. That it is a relatively small population. We're still relying on IAPT with improvements, and in the meantime, EBS has come up with an accommodation to meet the needs of those whose services wouldn't be met by IAPT, so that offer of the £900 to commission independent support.
Given the issues of mistrust in NHS institutions that have been outlined by others in their evidence, and the comparative advantages of specialist support that have been described, Dr. Stewart, I'm asked to ask you whether or not you consider IAPT is appropriate or sufficient provision for the infected and affected.
So I think IAPT is appropriate for a number of people. I don't think it is appropriate for everybody who is infected and affected, and that's why we welcome the additional provision from EBS for those whose needs aren't met by IAPT. though I would also say for anyone whose needs who aren't met by IAPT and whose needs are more specialist, there is also still the option of referral to other NHS services.
And I'm also asked to ask you this, what consideration has been given to the fact that, that mistrust in NHS institutions will decrease self-referrals to psychological services? And I think what lies behind this is the evidence that was given that people are being referred into psychology through the MDT or through the support schemes, the financial support schemes, and that's a way of getting round, if you like, the stigma of accessing services. So how does the IAP model deal with that particular issue?
Could you repeat that again?
Yes. So the question is, what consideration has been given to the fact that mistrust in NHS institutions, and also we could say stigma as well,
Yes.
will decrease self-referrals to psychological services? How does the IAPT model deal with that compared to the model where you've got psychological services sitting within MDTs or sitting within financial support schemes?
Yeah, and so again, it will. So I think it will very much depend on an individual and the nature of their mistrust. So if there is a generic mistrust in NHS services, then I'd go back to that is why we're not requiring people to take up IAPT if they are eligible that route. It is open to anyone to use the funding from EABS, even if they are eligible for IAPT support. So there is an alternative route for anyone who has a generic mistrust in NHS, kind of in the NHS or more generically. IAPT does also offer a route into support entirely independently of any link to current services for those with infected blood. They can just access it generically without going through that route as well, should they wish to do so.
So those are the questions that I'm going to ask from core participants and their legal representatives. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I think I do. Whether the service is a bespoke service is commissioned or not depends upon the DHSC, because they're the commissioning body. And your role as from the NHS England is to provide the advice to the DHSC which will help them, but won't determine necessarily what they commission. So the advice you give plays a part in the system which arises. I imagine in an ideal world you'd be looking for a system of psychological support which offered successful therapy to anyone who wanted it whenever they needed it.
Absolutely. But just in terms of general access to mental health support in England at present, that is unfortunately not the case. We are doing a lot to expand services.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because if we've listened to the experience of the three devolved nations here, and they've emphasised some features which I think you'd be bound to agree aren't necessarily present in the current offering to people in England. That is that the psychologist has the expertise to deal with the individual, because they already know and have some expertise in dealing with people who have suffered through everything that happened in respect of infected blood. And the accessibility, which they have each of them enthused about and wish to expand, making it easy to get access without necessarily even needing a referral to the services on offer. One of our witnesses spoke of their trying to get rid of hurdles in the way, which I think in general terms for psychological support you can see a case for. and I suppose particularly a case for people who may have seen, as they regard it, officialdom putting up hurdles in their getting any form of money to support them as time has gone on. That would also be, I think, a feature you would want to see reflected if you could.
I think in this and in a number of other areas, actually, the more we removed hurdles and barriers and enhanced access, which is why, you know, in a number of for IAPT and for some other services, we have made self-referral an option. That is where we would wish to go. So I think in an ideal world, that is what we would want to do, yes, for people with infected, who are infected and affected, but also wider populations. The question that comes into it, ultimately, there is also a question over kind of priorities and resources, and also different starting points in the different nations.
So when you talk about priority and resources, do you mean that there aren't enough clinical psychologists there to provide a service such as I've described in part?
I mean, we are so in part, but I think it is also a matter of ensuring that the funding and the commissioning is in place. But yes, it would also be workforce. We are expanding the workforce quite rapidly in England because we have a programme of expanding access to mental health services more generically, and the most significant rate limiting step is the availability of workforce and the time it takes to train the workforce.
And in terms of what was also said in the other nations about the risk of re-traumatising someone by having to explain to a doctor everything that's going on, quite apart from the re-traumatising experiences of this inquiry. Now, may I ask, the £900, which may cover 6 to 8 sessions, there or thereabouts, we think.
So the £900 is entirely separate. I don't know how many sessions the £900 would cover, because the £900 is to purchase support from a private provider. The 6 to 8 is what you might typically get on the NHS. I think we saw the evidence earlier that on average at the moment you get 8.1.
Can I interrupt to ask you to move a little bit closer to the microphone? You've
sorry.
moved away from the microphone.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. So the private provider is clearly not part of the NHS, not part of the system, at least not directly. They may work for the NHS at times, I don't know, but they're not part of the system which injured anyone affected. So one can see the attractions of allowing someone to not be re-traumatised by having to go back to the very institution which they've lost trust in because of what's happened. But how do they identify the right person to go in their area in order to provide the service?
You mean from a private provider? So, and I think it's relevant here. My assumption is, but I might need to double check with DHSC, is that the resource that they're developing is for all practitioners. So the resource that they're developing with specific advice on infected blood, and that would be available not just to NHS practitioners, but also to private practitioners who are commissioned with the £900. But yes, an ideal would be the service that has been described by others, where the knowledge is already there and the specialist knowledge is available.
The resource, when you, the way that it's put, it's as words, it could cover something like an e-learning course, for instance. I don't know if that's what you are trying to describe, or something rather different.
DHSC are commissioning that resource and providing that resource, so I don't know the specifics of what it would be. I would hope it is something that is easily accessed, like an e-learning resource. I think that would be helpful. And I realise I don't think I've answered the other part of your question earlier, which was about how people would know how to how to access. So EBS, on the EBS website, there is information both about how you access NHS talking therapies, but also information and advice about how you select a private provider and how on that website.
So in the particular context of those who've been giving evidence to me, they may see these as additional hurdles to getting therapy. Can you just tell me, is there evidence that you know of for the take-up of the £900 offer?
You would need to ask the EBS about that. I don't know, I'm afraid.
I think, Ms. Scott, I don't know if we've done that, have we?
I don't know is the answer to that. I don't know.
It might be quite revealing if, for instance, it showed that the take-up wasn't very great compared to the take-up of the services which exist in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, because it would tell you something about the reluctance to go to people who are unknown and don't necessarily have a lived experience in terms of giving therapy to people who have been infected or affected by contaminated blood.
Yes.
Yes. The other thing which I wanted to ask you about really was what you've said in paragraph 14 of your witness statement to us.
Should we get that up on the screen? It is WITN 7272001. And paragraph 14 is on page 5.
Page 5. Now, it's paragraph 14. NHSE will continue to advise and support DHSC and NHS BSA to review and enhance provision of psychological support and intervention. Now, what review and enhancement do you have in mind as being what you're going to potentially recommend in terms of policy?
So the advice that we're providing to DHSC and NHS BSA is primarily access to clinical expertise, because we have that in-house. We directly employ clinical experts. So a lot of the advice that we have been giving is in that ilk. We would expect, when we've got this advice from the outputs of this review as to the gap analysis, to be involved and advise on how we fill that.
And just going back 2 pages, please, in the statement. It's paragraph 8D. We understand that DHSC, now plainly this is just, in a sense, it's what you've been reported to you, has asked NHS BSA to publish additional enhancements to the EIBSS offer on their website. What's that about?
The honest answer is that I don't know. I know that. So I deliberately shared my evidence statement with DHSC and BSA because when I was asked to provide evidence, I was aware I could not give you full evidence without consulting colleagues in other organisations.
Yes.
So I have shared. It may well be that some of my clinical experts have been involved and know more than I do. I personally am not able to advise you on that.
Well, thank you. The words really beg a bit of expansion, additional enhancements. But we wait to see, in other words.
Yes, I think that ultimately would be for the department, given that they're in effect commissioning it from EBS. I think it would ultimately be for the department or EBS to notify you and let you know what that is.
Well, the final thing which I wanted to ask you about was this: the talk, the mentioning of the additional research, which is C, immediately above this. We just have a look at that, please, Lawrence. Thank you. Additional research to understand in greater detail the psychological treatment needs of those infected and affected, so that a comprehensive gap analysis can be completed. To what extent has there been discussion with Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and by all means, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, if I can call you that here, the witnesses, please come in on this one, in order to discuss with England what the needs are and how they might best be fulfilled.
So I know discussions have taken place because I have seen written reports of the discussions and views from certainly from Dr. Coffey to my left in some of the, but actually we were chatting in the break earlier, and I know we established who in EBS you've been talking to, so I'm aware those discussions have happened.
And may I ask, has that been the same experience as you've had in Scotland and Northern Ireland? That there's been discussions so that you can share your experience of how well the system has worked with you, with England?
From a Northern Ireland perspective, I'm not aware of anything formal having been discussed or requested to be discussed.
Yeah, I'd say from a Scottish perspective, I definitely haven't been approached. I'm aware the Scottish Infected Blood Psychology Service were part of some online meetings, but I'm unsure who that was with.
Can I just add that in the context of the clinical governance of psychological treatment, I'm confident that the psychological treatment provided by the specialists and the experts in Scotland has been effective in terms of enabling people to manage their distress and for that to be worked through. So I'm not quite sure what is being referred to in terms of the gap analysis.
Thank you.
And in terms of, as another head of service, I would second that. I mean, that there's, I suppose, quite comprehensive evidence as to what is useful in terms of the psychological needs in this kind of population, even in terms of without the infected aspect of it, which would be very relevant and applicable and appropriate to be used in these circumstances.
Thank you, Dr. Meakin. And now, Dr. Coffey, you were nodding there when there was discussion, talk about there having been discussions between England and Wales. Would I be right in thinking that, so far as you know about those discussions, the same sort of enthusiasm for the model which has been adopted by Wales has been expressed?
Yeah, I think that we had several requests from service managers for the EBS service about how our service was being run. One of the service managers joined us at a network meeting, which was with Scotland and Ireland. And we were very, I guess, passionate about our, I suppose, uncomfortableness with the IAPT involvement, because I suppose from our perspective, you know, we didn't think it was an appropriate way for it to kind of be managed, but we had lengthy discussions about it, and we did provide some written kind of accounts of why we thought the specialist service in-house would be more appropriate, really. So yeah, that did happen.
Right, well, thank you very much. There's nothing more that I have to ask. Scott.
May I just turn behind me, just check if there are any questions? No, no questions from the legal representatives of the witnesses. Invite each of you in turn in the panel to see whether or not there's something you would like to add. Should we start with Dr. Meakin? Is there anything you would like to add?
No, thank you. Yeah, I think most of us already said of our kind of deep hope to expand services and to really offer a much more comprehensive and wide service, and that's potentially, I suppose, some positive to come out of a very difficult situation.
Mrs. Leonard.
Nothing further from me, thank you.
Dr. Hacking.
I think that this inquiry has addressed well the issues that we'd like to put forward, so I don't want to put anything else forward, but I do know my colleague Grania would like to make a further submission.
I think we've covered a lot of what I hoped we would cover, and I suppose as a clinician that works day to day with many of these people, I've been very much in awe of people's resilience and determination and passion for equity and for good support for everybody. And both of our Scottish services truly wouldn't be in existence without that determination of the patient groups of Haemophilia Scotland and SIBF, and I suppose it's good to be here in support of them and the wider population, in the hopes that there will be more parity and equity of ongoing psychological support when we've truly heard how much this has impacted on everybody's physical health, their social well-being and their mental health well-being. So it felt very important to be part of the process.
Thank you.
Dr. Coffey.
I guess I just want to clarify what I said earlier about funding for the service, because I clarified it in the break. It was originally for 3 years, but Welsh Government have given, I guess, support that will be ongoing, and the finances around that are being agreed. So there's no, risk that service is going to come to an end in that time frame. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Dr. Stewart.
Nothing further from me, thank you.
Well, can I thank each and every one of you? My apologies for not doing it by name at this stage of the evening, but for being here and being patient with the IT systems that we've had. It's been very useful to hear from each of you and to understand the different approaches, what led to the psychological support that is currently offered in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, and what is under development in England, and the reasons why it hasn't yet developed, if it ever will. So thank you for that and for coming to the inquiry, or being prepared to come to the inquiry, and coming remotely in the case of those in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Thank you all. Monday,
we have another panel. We have Alex Chisham, Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service and Permanent Secretary to the Cabinet Office. We have Jane Brady, the Head of the Northern Irish Civil Service, Andrew Goodall, Welsh Government Permanent Secretary, and Leslie Fraser, Director General Corporate for the Scottish Government. The witnesses from Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland will be remote.
Yes. Monday, 10 o'clock.